everybody. I think we're going to get started, so if you could take your seats, there will be time for talking in the reception. Good evening. My name is Paisley Curra, and I'm the Executive Director of CLAGS. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 14th David R. Kessler Lecture in Lesbian and Gay Studies. This lecture, which is made possible by the generosity of David Kessler, is the highlight of the CLAGS year. It allows us to honor someone who has made a lifetime contribution to the field of LGBTQ studies. And this year, we're thrilled to honor Carole Vance. Throughout her career, and her career is far from over, this is just one momentary moment in it, Vance's contributions have been central to establishing the legitimacy of sexuality studies in a wide range of fields. She's mentored generations of new researchers, and few have done more to bridge activism, policy work, and intellectual inquiry. And I'm also happy to point out that Carole is a graduate of CUNY of Hunter College. My primary job tonight, though, isn't to pay tribute to Carole. We have testimonial speakers for that. My very pleasant task tonight is to express thanks to all those who make the work of CLAGS possible. CLAGS depends on the labor and the vision of our incredibly talented and dedicated board of directors. There isn't time to recognize everyone individually, but I would like board members to stand so we can thank them for their energy, their time, and their commitment. So please stand. A very handsome group. I'm also pleased to acknowledge Elisa Solomon, the third executive director of CLAGS, who's here tonight. Elisa, where are you? There she is. I feel that her shoe size is probably smaller than mine, but it's very impossible to fill those metaphorical shoes of hers. On behalf of the CLAGS board and myself, I want to express my deep gratitude to the exceptionally talented and hardworking CLAGS staff for their energy, labor, commitment, and their incredible good sense. So I'd like to thank Preston Batista, Sarah Ganter, Megan Jenkins, Claudia Pisano, Lavelle Porter, and Chung Ping Yen. If they could stand so we could thank them. They probably are working, but there's Sarah of them. There's Sarah. So it's not possible to acknowledge all the luminaries here tonight, but our thanks to all of you in the audience for your scholarship, your activism, your art, your commitment to social justice, and for showing that knowledge can change politics and that politics can change knowledge. This coming year, CLAGS is going to be celebrating its 15th anniversary, and we hope that you'll join us at our special anniversary events. We'll be honoring CLAGS founders, remembering key moments of controversy and debate, and imagining future possibilities for LGBT studies. And of course, we're always looking for volunteers, so anybody who is interested in planning some of those events and serving on that committee, please see me after. So here comes the pitch part of the evening. You probably all know that CLAGS is a membership organization, but perhaps you don't know that less than 7% of our operating budget comes from the Graduate Center. That means that we rely on your support for everything we do, our conferences and public programming, our fellowships and awards, our colloquium series, our seminars in the city, our international projects, and the many other projects we have in the works. We are deeply grateful for every single contribution, from the many, many people who send in $10 checks, to those of you who join at the $35 and $100 levels, to those of you who are major donors and send us $250 or more. At CLAGS, our supporters are truly appreciated, and there really just aren't that many organizations where you give $250 and you're like a fat cat major donor. We will have a party in your honor once a week. So do consider supporting us. So if you're already a member of CLAGS, thank you for your commitment. If you're not yet, we invite you to join. Please stop by our membership table in the lobby to sign up for our mailing list, to renew your membership, or to join, or to give us an end-of-the-year gift, and we take credit cards. Now to the main event. We're very pleased to have two introductory testimonials from luminaries in their own right, Vance and Douglas Crimp. Let me introduce them. Vance has been a feminist activist since 1969 and teaches literature and gender studies at the New School for Social Research. Although Professor Sitow is a specialist in English literature, she is known in East and Central Europe, especially as a feminist activist and the co-founder of the Network of East-West Women. She has published broadly on feminist themes and has edited with Rachel Blau Duplessis the Feminist Memoir Project, Voices from Women's Liberation, and with Christine Stansel and Sharon Thompson, Powers of Desire, The Politics of Sexuality. Douglas Crimp received his PhD from the City University of New York in 1994. He is currently Fannie Knapp Allen Professor of Art History and co-director of the Visual and Cultural Studies program at the University of Rochester. Crimp is the author of Melancholia and Moralism, Essays on AIDS and Queer Politics, On the Museum's Ruins, and the editor of AIDS, Cultural Analysis, Cultural Activism. So I will turn it over to Anne, and thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you very much, Paisley. It's a great honor to be doing this. I first started to talk to Carole Vance about, among other things, sexuality around 1980, 1981. At that time, Sharon Thompson, Christine Stansel, and I were just beginning the process of editing the collection of essays that became Powers of Desire, The Politics of Sexuality. One of my early conversations with Carole was certainly a key moment in the evolution of that book. I was telling Carole how skeptical our publisher was that serious and good essays could be found on the heretofore sleazy subject of sexuality. Carole replied with more than her usual heat. Well, I hope you won't fill up the whole thing with articles about menstruation, menopause, and breastfeeding. Certainly we weren't planning for our book to be about such things, but Carole's irritation about the very idea focused the mind. Vance thought that articles about maternal health or tampons would be evasions. She was forcing a blank space to open up. We had to ask the question of how to write about sexuality. What bounded this subject, giving it shape? And we couldn't just turn to feminism for answers. As Gail Rubin was later to argue, feminism wasn't then a particularly privileged starting point for developing an open discourse about sexuality. Nor, of course, was Carole herself about to offer a declarative sentence, beginning with the words, "Sexuality is," and then the answer. Her interest was in the questions and in the reasons why they were so rarely asked. Rather than taking it for granted, she found the prevailing ignorance and silence about sexuality constantly surprising. This ignorance and silence had already become part of her subject when we started talking. So before anything else, my gratitude to Carole for saving us from collecting all those articles on menstruation. Though, in a recent conversation, we agreed that there are probably some really good articles to be written about sexuality and menstruation, and sexuality and breastfeeding, not to mention menopause, now a hot sexual topic in my crowd. And we observed these pieces about sexual experience probably aren't written yet, as so many others are not yet written. This subject of what has and has not been speakable about sexuality brings me to the world historical event, the Barnard Scholar and Feminist Conference No. 9, Towards a Politics of Sexuality, which Carole, as coordinator, conceptualized, starting with the evocative phrase in her conference proposal, pleasure and danger. These words have entered the language so completely that many have no idea they originated with her. The dynamic tension between sexual pleasure and danger now seems, well, obvious. Since I was on the Barnard Planning Committee, a group of about 25 women who met weekly for about 8 months to put the conference together, I see many other people from the group are here tonight too. How wonderful. I am an early witness to a mysterious and wonderful process which over these almost 25 years I've watched Carole initiate again and again. She makes it possible for a group to think. Out of this thinking, she makes it possible for the group to act. In a group led by Carole, though she would never accept that word, led, precise and careful intellectual work fuses with the political need to change the terms of public conversation. Out of a concentrated collective effort, words in common use get regrouped or evolve in meaning, and new words appear to discuss sexuality which simply weren't available before. Indeed, Carole is the most effective discourse warrior I have ever encountered. I'm opening the diary of a conference on sexuality. Have you seen it? Sometimes people know about it and sometimes they don't. It's full of naked people and doing various things. And Carole's notes on the Barnard conference, preparatory meetings, and it's sort of a precursor to Caught Looking, which came some years later. Again, I wonder if people have seen it or know it. Depends, I guess, which generation you're from. So as I'm opening this extraordinary little book, the diary moves me to remember a bitter moment. It was confiscated by Barnard College on the eve of the conference, probably in part because of angry phone calls from Women Against Pornography. But even more, I think, this amazing move came out of the college leadership's sheer panic at the shamelessness of the diary, its air of free speculation, and the depths to which we as a group had sometimes reached, guided by Carole. I'm amazed to find how fresh it all still is, how willing to talk about sexuality people eventually became, and how productive our seminar was of new ideas and new combinations. The word pleasure enters early, ushered in by a brave Carole, and once there, the word refuses to leave. It gathers meanings and becomes the core of the whole discussion. One of Carole's first questions in her invitation letter to the group was to ask urgently, how do women get sexual pleasure in patriarchy? Flipping to another page, I find, is it possible that abortion on the right and pornography among feminists function in similar ways as metaphor? To the right, abortion is a metaphor for moral turpitude. To some feminists, pornography is a metaphor for moral turpitude. This clever formulation, with its constant and anxiety about sexuality on both sides, cloaked on both sides in moralism, is a reminder, if we need one, that any discussion among feminists about sexuality was already fraught in the fall of 1981 when we began our conversations. Women Against Violence Against Women in California had transmogrified into Women Against Pornography in New York in a dramatic march through that then tawdry zone of so-called iniquity, Times Square. The potential for a conversation about sexuality arising from the sexual revolution, from feminism, from radical gay and lesbian movements was receding before our eyes. An open inquiry was shifting into a falsely confident campaign against sexual arousal, assumed to be dangerous to women. Carole, in her rare combination of cautious academic skepticism and great political daring, wanted above all the conversation, the development of research and theory which might support the general ongoing project of sexual freedom, and particularly women's right to be free subjects enjoying active sexual lives. Aware of the growing hysteria about sexuality in both the country and the women's movement, Carole sought to slow everything down, She was asking us all to calm ourselves, to think about what was happening, to speculate about how we could continue to talk about sexual desire at a time like this. About the drama of the conference itself, I can say little more here, but I would like to leave you with one clarification and an image. Many have characterized the sex wars in feminism as starting around the time of Barnard Conference and hardening into two rival positions about the meaning of sexuality. I see it completely differently. As I would try to explain to journalists who called me up and asked, was I in the pro-sex or the anti-sex faction, no such parallelism existed. Anti-pornography feminists were actually formulating definitions of sexuality and designing draconian remedies for what they saw as women's victimization in modern sexual culture. They adopted a politics of rage in the face of the slowdown in feminist progress. In their unearned certainty, they sought to pass laws against sexual speech and images as if they knew, without doubt, what, to use the stricken vocabulary of that time, degrades women. I really hate that word, degrades. To lean on the state just as the country was accelerating its turn to the right was a dangerous choice, a strategy oddly echoing the circumscribed choices of women in the 19th century. The so-called pro-sex faction was frightened by this feminist move towards state control. To our horror, some feminists were threatening a war on so-called smut, just as we were beginning to come out and talk about the ambiguities of our sexual choices. Were we to hang ourselves, choose protection over exploration? Why in the world would we want state control over an only recently created taboo-breaking civil society? Were we to lose the territory we were just discovering, where sexuality was seen as socially constructed and therefore changeable, and therefore our collective social responsibility? The conference was a reassertion, not of some positivist entity like lesbian sadomasochism or childhood sexuality or naughty fantasies, but of the right to talk about such things with curiosity, not shame, with an appreciation of our variety, rather than an anxious need for closure about the embarrassing and barely known. Though we all felt this urgency to resist closure, perhaps Carole felt it most, simply because of her always amazing prescience. I've learned recently that Gail Rubin used to say that Carole had one of those very high dog whistles, and other people can't. Had what do you call it? A way of listening to that high-pitched dog whistle that nobody else could hear, that said anti-pornography was coming. She saw what was coming in the years ahead. The closing down of whole discourses, official state-mandated silences on everything from abortion to AIDS, repressions which it was hard even to imagine then. Carole's famous political antennae were out. At the time Barnard seemed to be merely one event among many, I remember the Women Against Pornography picketing the conference, selling T-shirts which said on the front, "For a feminist sexuality," and on the back, "and against SM." How ridiculous, we thought. Christine Stanso laughed and said to the pickets, "How cute, do you have baby sizes?" This just tells you how many of us still felt confident that the radically exploratory ethos of feminism would ultimately hold its own, even on the ground of sexuality. But as I recall, Carole wasn't laughing, and particularly not at the leaflet the damning leaflet that went with the T-shirts. And she fostered an ongoing life for the community which had grown up around the planning for Barnard. So, when Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin proposed their Minneapolis ordinance against pornography, Carole had no trouble in calling us all back together again. Fact, the Feminist Anti-Censorship Task Force came into existence overnight, not to offer our own definitions of good or bad sex or good or bad images, but to resist what we saw as a fundamental change in the tactics, values, and goals of our political movement for women's liberation. I remember our shared sense of dismay as we met night after night and through the weekends to craft a response that would not attack other feminists nor take their fears of sexual repression lightly, but which would critique their definitions and their strategies. Yes, friends, the pro-sex faction was very active on Saturday nights. We heated up into a veritable fever of leaflet writing. One part of Carole's story, and perhaps of the story of many here this evening at Claggs, is the story of facing backlash at this very first hand. To many of our colleagues and friends, our involvement in this turn in feminist politics seemed slimy, unprofessional, tainted, irrelevant, somehow like sex itself. In intellectual circles, some of this disdain and disrespect has eased off now, for among other reasons, because of Carole's relentless resistance to any denigration of sex as subject. Due to the work of so many, some of them here tonight, and some of them directly inspired by Carole, social construction theory is now accepted, not as an orthodoxy, but as a starting point for raising questions about the complexity and variety of sexual experience. Yet it's amazing how much the stigma lingers. I believe it has been difficult, but Carole has continued to be shameless. She has refused to change the subject. She keeps asking about how people understand sexuality, how they are often manipulated by their sexual ignorance and fears, how they resist taboos on pleasure. I remember Carole sitting quietly through hours of testimony at the horrific right-wing hearings of the Meese Commission on Pornography. She seemed hardly to know those rude women, her colleagues, sitting in the front row with gags on their mouths, reading "censored," or marching outside, including some beautiful butches dressed as the sex police. No one could hardly guess that a prime mover of resistance to the Meese Commission, a prime publicist of its excesses and absurdities, was this polite blonde wearing a sweet skirt, sweater set, and pearls. Who could dream that she was so relentless and so effective in fusing a body of counter-opinion still reliably present in the culture wars we are fighting now? People are always grabbing Carole's ideas because they need them. They reframe our understanding and suggest ways forward. And I worry that I haven't made this clear because I think it's such an elusive and unusual truth. Her talent is so novel that I fear that it's hard to express in the culture we live in at this moment. Carole influences the course of public debates not only through her original thinking and writing, but through joining with others in this process. The group she fosters makes history beyond any individual's capability. Douglas and I have agreed to divide up the narrative of Carole's tireless course. He will carry this story on about how Carole helped artists resist congressional censorship and how, in an extraordinary last 8 years, she has brought people together from different disciplines and parts of the world to talk about the current politics of sexuality in ways that have changed how people think about AIDS, prostitution, trafficking, and the human right to sexual self-determination. So I'll stop here with this assertion of Carole's rarity. She is not only brilliant in herself, but the cause, that is, of brilliance in others. All those who work on sex, as the shorthand is, are in her debt. She has been making room for us and putting our names and words into history tirelessly for 30 years. Our rare Carole, whom it feels so right to be celebrating tonight. Douglas?
there will inevitably be a certain repetition in the praise that I have for Carole. I have a vivid memory of the first time that I heard Carole Vance lecture. Nearly 20 years ago, the occasion was one of a series of lectures organized by the artist Barbara Kruger and the editor Phil Mariani, given at the Dia Art Foundation space on Mercer Street in Soho. Carole spoke about the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography, which was convened by Ronald Reagan's Attorney General Edwin Meese, and clearly mandated, in advance of its own hearings, to recommend the sort of clamping down on sexual freedom that has been both a goal and an instrument of the fundamentalist right from that time to the present. One of Carole's crucial contributions throughout her career has been to identify, analyze, and combat these repressive governmental strategies centered on sex. I recall my first encounter with Carole here to try to specify some of the qualities that make her work so effective. I remember one moment of Carole's lecture at Dia particularly. The talk was, appropriately enough, given the art world context, about the use of images by the Meese Commission in its hearings, staged at 6 locations around the country, hearings that Carole attended and covered for the nation. The moment I remember is itself an image, the image of a ship capsizing. Let me read this passage from Carole's talk, in which she discusses the contradictory show and tell deployment of porn images by the Meese Commission for what she called the pleasures of condemnation. These pleasures, she said, were intense. The atmosphere throughout the hearings was one of excited repression. Witnesses alternated between chronicling the negative effects of pornography and making sensationalized presentations of it. Taking a lead from feminist anti-pornography groups, everyone had a slideshow. The FBI, the U.S. Customs Service, the U.S. Postal Service, and sundry vice squads. At every lights out, spectators would rush to one side of the room to see the screen, which was angled toward the commissioners. Were the hearing room a ship, we would have capsized many times. This was one of the many moments of Carole's talk that cracked up her audience, and it is one that I love to recount. But what is my point in recounting it? That Carole Vance is delightfully funny when she talks about sex and its enemies. Yes, of course, that's part of my point. But I would not be the follower of Michel Foucault that I am if I were to leave it at that. Foucault's analysis of what he called the repressive hypothesis has made it impossible to feel smug any longer about being unafraid of sex, to think of oneself as liberated and enlightened while all of those others are pathetically repressed. And Carole's insight is much more complex than that. The image of the capsizing ship that stays in my mind about the Meese Commission, created so economically and comically by Carole, is an image of the sinister manipulation of sex, the sinister manipulation of the excitements, fears, and conflicts associated with sex, for the purposes of increasing the state's interference in our lives, and not merely our sex lives, and of decreasing the state's responsibilities for social well-being and justice. Carole created that image and the complexity and urgency of its meaning, resulting in its persistence in my memory, with the patience of her research, the alertness of her investigative journalism, the sharpness and dry wit of her prose style, the modesty and dignity of her stage presence, and a genuine respect for her audience. Sex is not easy to talk about. It's a subject that has a way of making people stupid or boastful or coy. But Carole has shown us, through her example, how to think and talk about sex without becoming silly, narcissistic, or embarrassed. More important, she's demonstrated that we must think and talk wisely about sex if we are to have any chance to prevail over those who seek to use sex against us. I return here to my first memory of Carole speaking about sex for yet a different reason than the insight she brings to the subject. I also return to it because of the context in which she spoke, the art world. Carole's tracking the Mies Commission and subsequent reporting on it was extremely prescient. She understood early on the uses to which the right would make of representations of sex in the long culture wars that followed. How the right would use fear, shame, and confusion about sex to gut the National Endowment for the Arts, to prevent explicit safer sex education in the AIDS epidemic, and now to turn issues of migration and sexual and labor rights under conditions of globalization into a classic sex panic over trafficking in women. I especially love the title of one of Carole's conference talks on this last subject, Hiss the Villain. Carole's ability to move outward from her own academic disciplines, anthropology and public health, and cross into, in this case, my own specialization, contemporary art, is exemplary of the way Carole does interdisciplinarity. Not only does Carole bridge the disciplines in her own work on sex, she has also a long and distinguished career of making it possible for others to do so. In 2 articles published in Art in America, Carole provided those of us in the art world who were completely blindsided by Jesse Helms the tools for thinking about what was happening to us. Carole is a facilitator. She brings people together to make possible necessary conversations and pleasurable and dangerous conversations. A few years ago, I had the privilege of working with Carole as a fellow at Columbia University in the Rockefeller Foundation-funded program for the study of sexuality, gender, health, and human rights, which Carole conceived and directed. The program involved 8 years of weekly seminars on the intersection of these subjects by humanities scholars and social scientists, medical and public health professionals, and international human rights activists and lawyers, representing a variety of intellectual, professional, and activist perspectives that is far broader than the usual sort of interdisciplinarity that those of us working in the academy are used to. I was amazed to see how skillfully and with what considerateness and grace Carole facilitated these conversations among people who did not by any means speak the same language. She seemed able immediately to zero in on what each of us could most profitably contribute to the discussion, to draw it out of us, and to make the necessary translations across the varying discourses. In the summer following my fellowship year, Carole's Rockefeller program, together with the Law and Policy Project at the Columbia School of Public Health, sponsored a roundtable for sexual rights workers from around the world at the Harriman Estate, the old Harriman Estate in the Catskills that is now a Columbia University conference center. Carole was our host for 3 days of intensive meetings, shared meals, and evening film screenings. Every bit of this was a pleasure. Carole was fun, she was funny, and she knew how to make it possible for the participants to get important work done on a grueling schedule. I must say it was a very grueling schedule, while at the same time feeling like we were at some sort of summer camp for adults. Carole's rigorous scholarship and teaching about sexuality and her generous work as a facilitator of discussions about sexual rights have reverberated around the globe. For 5 years, she has co-directed and taught in the Summer Institute on Sexuality, Culture, and Society at the International School of the University of Amsterdam, where her students, academics, and human rights activists come from every continent. Two of her students there eventually founded their own Institute on Sexuality and Rights in India in 2002, and they've invited Carole each year to be a visiting professor. In just the past decade, Carole has participated in international sexuality and rights conferences in Brazil, Cuba, Sweden, Thailand, Vietnam, and Italy, as well as throughout the US and Canada. Carole Vance gets around. And now she's here to tell us about her travels with sex. Please join me in welcoming the 14th Kessler Lecturer, Carole Vance.
Thank you. This is such a great honor, and I'm indebted to so many people for, well, coming tonight, certainly, and being part of these many, many conversations. My travels with sex started in Astoria, Queens. This is a New York story. I was 7 or 8 years old. The location was Sunday school. The occasion did not involve small furry mammals, little playmates, doctor games, or adult bad behavior. The point of origin was Good Friday, the Easter story, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. As the Sunday school teacher explained it all to my class, I was willing to go along. I was only 7 or 8 and not at all resistant, but I wanted to know, how did it work? For example, what happened to Jesus' body inside the tomb? Did it stay the same or did it change? Did it get cold? If he was dead, did he stop breathing? When did he start breathing again? Before they took the rock away or later when people woke him up? When he woke up, was he hungry? Did he remember what happened? Did he need to go to the bathroom? Though having nothing to do with sex at all, this moment did have to do with temperament, a certain inclination, an interest on my part in the mechanics of bodies and social life. The more incomprehensible, the more interested I was in understanding how did it work. One could only feel sorry for my Sunday school teachers, indeed all of my teachers, whom I would like to thank tonight. My education continued in Latin and Greek, which I majored in college, interrupted at the end by the very thrilling discovery of anthropology. Thrilling because of its deconstructive tools, its comparative method, and its commitment to attending to subjectivity as well as material and structural forces. Best of all, unlike in classics, where the supply of glazed jars, torn manuscripts, and poetry snippets was finite and more intensively mined by scholars with every passing minute, humans were continually producing new and fantastic behaviors, institutions, problems, and symbols for anthropologists to think about. A growth area, clearly. My entry to graduate school in anthropology at Columbia coincided with the second wave of feminism. Many moments come to mind, including with my fellow students interested in this topic, ransacking literally the card catalog in the library, Women, and pulling out every book we could find under that title. We would read anything. Of course, it was very difficult to make sense of any of it because at that moment we didn't have and were trying to develop, along with many other people, a way to think critically about the facts presented there and ways to develop new conceptual tools to think about gender. Another memory involves sitting in at the healthcare service, student health care, because it refused to provide reproductive health care and birth control to female students.
With a stern expression, the medical director in his white coat told us that he was going to call the police, and that although all athletic injuries of male students were fully covered, the health service could not support what he scornfully called our extracurricular activities. I remember in the course of anthropology doctoral study almost being kicked out because some doubted that I was really serious about anthropology since I was so distracted by gender. And in 1971, when picking a comprehensive exam topic, I was told that sex roles was not a legitimate topic of inquiry in anthropology in the Department of Margaret Mead. Miraculously, I completed my dissertation, never having taken a course or heard a lecture about sexuality. But feminism's abiding interest in sexuality, in projects of expanding women's sexual freedom and decreasing patriarchal punishments and control, inspired endless discussions with colleagues, with friends, as did the gay and lesbian movement. Feminism, too, like anthropology, had a strongly denaturalizing bent in its questioning of biologically reductionist explanations for gender relations, just so stories about how inequality came to be, and just who benefited from the protections that women's sexuality required. Anthropology's great reputation for sexual exploration led me to think that perhaps reading more deeply in the anthropological literature about sexuality would be helpful, despite the fact that no course had ever been offered in this topic in my department. Well, a young faculty member at CUNY, I taught at Lehman College, I submitted a faculty development grant to do, in retrospect, this incredibly modest and conventional annotated bibliography about anthropological works on biocultural influences on human sexuality. The grant was rejected, and I got the review sheets. I read them with interest. One said, "I was too young to do this work." The other said, "I didn't have the skills to do this work because I couldn't read Japanese." And therefore, I would be unable to understand, in its original form, the important new work on a type of monkey, the Japanese macaque, that held the clue to primate learning and human sexuality. How did this work, I thought? This area, I thought, was crazier than I expected. There had to be something here really worth looking into. So these reviews were inspirational, not discouraging. Beginning to think that anthropology was perhaps not the way forward, I attended a special program at a well-known sexology institute, which other participants happily called Mecca. They had come to Mecca. I and a very few other colleagues, one female, one male, but together we were called those three women from New York, found the program somewhat appalling, deeply sexist, totally devoid of any gender theory, but we also had to recognize that this isolation and disconnection from developments in disciplines was a result of the discipline's rejection of sexuality as a legitimate topic of inquiry at that time. My first paper arose from an analysis of this training and the way gender and sexuality were thought about, as well as important intellectual frameworks that were common in this field. My first paper then was given at a very important conference, the first I ever attended, a conference on sexuality and power given in New York at NYU in 1978 and organized by Terry Collins, among other people. My paper was a curious mix, and I was not familiar with how to combine analysis with rage. But the audience clearly thought the most comic element of my paper, an instructive element, was an analysis of a cartoon that was shown to illustrate in a lighthearted way the operations of heterosexuality. Deep Donut, it was called, a kind of evocation of deep throat. In this cartoon, a naturalized male aggression was amusingly depicted by a male pickle chasing around a female donut with a great deal of comic interest in the donut's hole. Complex deconstructive tools not required. The paper was hysterically funny, I would admit, but as in a great deal of my work, I can take little credit since all quotes as heard. At the conclusion of my paper, a posse of gay men materialized around me. Among them, I would learn, Jonathan Katz and John D'Amelio. They looked at me with great puzzlement but interest. Who was I? Perhaps I had flown in from another planet. They didn't know, but were very welcoming, immediately inviting me to join their study group, which I did. And these and other study groups were very germinal spaces for work on sexuality, not the university. And I make a point of saying this both to note the way things have changed, but also to, I think, give credit where credit was due. The intellectual spaces that supported this kind of inquiry were not in the universities at that time. And important sources of reading and new ideas were not academic journals for the most part, but community-published newspapers like The Body Politic out of Toronto or Gay Community News out of Boston, where early work by many people, John D'Amelio, Jeffrey Weeks, was published. At this time, for work on sexuality, I would say there were no academic rewards. For a long time during this period, I never listed anything I wrote about sexuality on my CV. There was no point. It was a kind of hobby, an extra thing I did, as many people did the same. And in fact, at the time that I jaunted around the country following the Mies Commission on Pornography, my real work was to work on one of the first HIV grants funded by NIMH. The questions that we thought about in these study groups, in part were questions posed very indirectly with great resonance by the gay and feminist political movement. And our relation to these questions, I think, was also a very complex one, filled with self-reflection, questioning, a desire to understand, well, how things work. And since scholars and researchers do not live on ether, I also need to say I'm greatly indebted in these efforts to New York City public education, to public elementary schools, to CUNY Hunter College, to Hunter College High School, to rent control, and to many teachers. And I note these things because so many of them have been eroded and diminished in terms of the space that people have to benefit from things like that now. By 1978 and 1979, as Ann had mentioned, Women Against Pornography came to New York with their ubiquitous slideshow. Everyone was seeing it. It was a great puzzle. It began with a series of critiques of sexism in the media, which certainly was a staple of feminism from the beginning, and with which we were all very comfortable. But somehow, as the slideshow went on and reached its conclusion, something went wrong. We started with sexism in the media is detrimental, and we ended with masturbation leads to rape. How did that work? Something went wrong somewhere, but where was it? What went wrong, I think, is obvious to us now, but that's only because of the work people did in trying to deconstruct what we came to call the slippery slope. How starting at point A, in a kind of obvious feminist analysis, then moved you along through visual tricks, sleights of hand, sensation, alarming images, substitution of one thing to another, that moved you to very peculiar moments. This experience pushed many people to think about and develop analytic tools to think about visual imagery. sexual behavior, how to achieve social change, the place of sexuality in movements of social reform. And we felt tremendous uneasiness as movements that critiqued sexism in the media narrowed to focus on sexism in sexual representation, and instead of attacking sexism in many different forms, began to attack sexuality as a substitute. It's a little-known fact, one that I just realized by reviewing some notes, that when I was first approached to be the academic coordinator of the Barnard Conference, it was because I was an anthropologist, and people at the Women's Center at Barnard had imagined the next conference would explore the theme of cross-cultural motherhood. I suggested instead that given the debates that were starting to appear in feminism about sexuality, including the appearance of the very important sex issue of Heresy's magazine, perhaps we would pick the topic of sexuality and feminism. The committee, though, had to decide. It wasn't up to me, and far from being a hand-picked group of people, most of the people who assembled on that first day were total strangers to me. We began. An extraordinary study group, a very intense experience. We began, comically, given Anne's comments on my screed against menopause and menstruation, with the easy thing: teenage girls, women's experience, borrowing a little from a kind of CR strategy. People started to say, well, when women start to menstruate, when I started to menstruate, No, 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 others interjected. It wasn't like that for me at all. This was the easy part, I thought, the easy topic. I can see these discussions are going to be incredibly interesting, and I'm very indebted to all the members of that committee for their incredible thought and work and devotion over what was an 8-month study group that just unrolled. We explored many of the things that Anne suggested, but by the time of the conference in April of 1982, many strange things converged. A panic set off by calls to Barnard administrators and trustees complaining that the conference had been taken over by a group of sexual perverts. It was the first moment in my experience that what would be a disagreement within feminism had been taken outside the movement to another institution, who was then asked to discipline some faction. Alarmed, the president scrutinized the conference's program, which looked like any conference in the Scholar and Feminist series. It's written in a special code, they said. It's meant to fool you. In a panic, the Barnard administration examined and seized this 100-page booklet, The Diary of a Conference on Sexuality. They also tried to get us all to say that the diary was delayed at the printers, which we would not do. And in my comments, let me make clear that, of course, this was Barnard College and the Women's Center of 1982, and I have nothing but the greatest respect and admiration for the people both in the Women's Center and the Barnard administration at this moment. What was their panic about? Off the record, I had endlessly fascinating conversations with people who had received such calls or could report on people's distress about specific images. Some might have been predictable, but one that caused great upset was part of a triptych. In one of the images, a baby was approaching a woman's breast, and the viewer thought the baby's mouth looked very aggressive. This was my first meeting with the subjectivity of images, the diversity of how people interpreted them, their incredible power to alarm and frighten, and the way visual imagery was, in this period, critical to getting sex panics underway. The double-pronged action that resulted, the seizure of the diary and the distribution of these totally vicious leaflets at the door of the conference, denouncing us all for promoting non-feminist forms of sexuality, and describing in great detail the alleged sexual behavior of specific speakers in an effort to demonize them. In writing about this, I utilized the term moral panic, originated by Stanley Cohen and introduced into the sexuality literature first by Jeffrey Weeks, but I changed it to be sex panic. All of the English work about moral panics, the mods and rockers, delinquents, drug abusers, all of that descriptive work was almost never about sex, and it seemed really critical to indicate that this was a panic about sex. The Barnett Conference, well, it was a great success. Though it had devastating fallout for many individuals. People couldn't get jobs, they were deemed too controversial. We had to threaten to sue Barnett College to get the diary reprinted, and Barnett, under duress, agreed, spending a considerable amount of money to remove 2 lines of type from the entire publication that said Barnett College. And so began the so-called feminist sex wars. Looking back on it, what is interesting is that then, at the time of the conference and for a few years after, the main issues were pornography, SM, and butch film roles. We could say that perhaps the debate about pornography was a kind of at-a-remove discussion of the meaning of heterosexuality to women under patriarchy. And I was always puzzled, though, by the fascination with the other topics. They were dropped when momentarily some of these feminist issues moved into more public discourse because they were somewhat unintelligible, in these other arenas. But I was very puzzled by being invited to run a few study groups for quite serious feminists, and all they wanted to talk about was lesbian SM. Week after week after week. None of them were lesbians as far as I could see. And although they were trying to be open-minded, they weren't condemnatory. They were troubled by many things. The involvement of objectification, capitalism, consumerism, and one could only look around at their houses and their lives, and I include myself there too, and think, wouldn't it be more productive to describe these issues and analyze these issues in terms that were more immediately meaningful? One could say that these kind of discussions are slightly harmless, except for the point that having your discussion on the basis of someone else's experience or life in which they have no ability to articulate or describe, because they are not part of the discussion, and that the remedies and interventions you cook up resulting from your analysis of these topics impinge on them, not you. This was a lesson I learned and was repeated many, many other times. Soon after, anti-porn feminists developed civil rights anti-pornography ordinances that moved outside of feminism and were introduced in many places. Minneapolis, Indianapolis. When it came to Nassau County, some of us drove out there to take a look. And it was the moment when the dire predictions that feminist anti-pornography rhetoric would be captured or appropriated by the right wing materialized in the form of a large number of bussed-in evangelicals waving Bibles and urging the legislature in this county to pass a civil rights anti-pornography ordinance. In the end, soon after 1986, these approaches were ruled unconstitutional, and which was affirmed by the Supreme Court. But what is important is, in this moment, what had been an internal discussion and dispute within feminism began to move elsewhere and move into other kind of legislative domains, eventually into other countries and into other policy arenas. Douglas has given you a pretty good idea about the Mies Commission. I read about it in the newspaper, and I thought, well, that sounds kind of interesting and wacky. I'm going to go to one of their hearings. So I went to one about social science in Houston, just on my own. And as I've written in one of my articles, the first hearing featured the testimony of a young man. At age 12, he said, I was a typical normal healthy boy, and my life was filled with normal activities and hobbies. But all the trouble began a few months later when he found a deck of hardcore pornographic playing cards. These porno cards highly aroused me and gave me a desire I never had before. Soon after, his behavior changed. He began to masturbate. He attempted to catch glimpses of partially dressed neighborhood women and surreptitiously tried to steal Playboy magazines from the newsstand. His chronicle went on, ending with his discovery of Jesus Christ and his being saved from this terrible condition. The audience sat in attentive silence. No one laughed. Only a few cynical reporters sitting next to me elbowed each other and rolled their eyes, although their stories in the next day paper would contain respectful accounts of the witness's remarks and those of his therapist, who testified as an expert witness that many of his patients were being treated for mental problems brought on by pornography. How did this work? That 400 people sat in a courthouse and listened to this testimony, and no one laughed. I thought it was an important question. And trying to understand that led me to follow the Mies Commission around to all their subsequent hearings. Pornography and slaves. You can see I was enslaved by the Pornography Commission. I was especially interested in understanding how they were able to mobilize shame and sensation, the way in which their telling of secrets was erotic, and indeed the pleasures of condemnation. They too, like feminist anti-pornography advocates, endorsed ways of reading images through totalitarian voiceovers that obscured diversity and individual reception of and subjectivity, and the ways in which attacks on images are indeed proxies and beginnings of attacks on communities and sexual practices. The Mies Commission marked a very important watershed in the right wing's effort to reach out to the mainstream public, as they tried to pioneer new arguments for the mainstream that would not involve sin and immorality. So they experimented with arguments drawn from social science, that pornography contained violent imagery that caused violence against women, or anti-feminist pornography argumentation that pornography degraded women. They didn't get too far with the attempt to co-opt social science rhetoric simply because social scientists objected to it, but their co-optation of feminist rhetoric was extremely important. And that is the moment where words like degradation entered the right-wing vocabulary, used by them in polyvalent ways to mean, of course, to their audience, immorality of sex outside of reproduction, but heard by more diverse audiences to mean all sorts of objectionable sexism. For the first time then, too, right-wing figures began to embrace the issue of violence against women, which they had previously rejected as fantastical accusations dreamed up by man-hating feminists. They turned on a dime and began to say, yes, women were subjected to a huge amount of domestic and sexual violence. But why was that? Because of feminism. Feminism had unleashed male desire from reproduction and marriage and unmoored it, giving women no protection. The fallout of the Mies Commission was significant and continues to that day. Federally coordinated data banks and strategies across states aimed at increasing obscenity convictions, the use of so-called organized crime statutes to increase the penalties for people charged and convicted, and what's just resurfaced again recently, demands that purveyors of sexual imagery prove that all their models are adults, including images retrospectively taken, which simply of course, can't be done. The morphing of these techniques of visual mobilization, of the use of sensation and shame, of course, was deployed to great effect in the NEA. At first, almost accidentally, because the shows attacked actually had stopped traveling around the United States at the time that one angry evangelical wrote a letter to Donald Wildman. But once a sex panic starts, it's always worth a good ride, and in fact, politicians who had attempted to almost eradicate, or at the very least diminish, the NEA through previous attacks on its budget as a waste of taxpayers' money got nowhere, because all sorts of community groups throughout the country angrily defended their arts organization that received money from the NEA. The big lesson to me here was that politics that are going nowhere can be moved forward by adding sex panic to it, or add sex and stir. And as Douglas had said, it's not that I was so clever to recognize this de novo. In fact, when the NEA started to unfold, I recognized tactics that had been used for a number of years, both within anti-porn feminism and then within the Mies Commission. Interesting things began to happen in the international arena. Various developments presaged the ways that questions of sexuality were moving around the world. First, efforts to put women's rights on the agenda of human rights groups used sexual violence as the premier and seemingly universal and very effective exemplar of women's violation. Important UN conferences in Cairo on population and Beijing on women introduced new ideas of reproductive and sexual rights that had great promise, which of course immediately inspired a tremendous backlash. Gay and lesbian groups were beginning to use the human rights system and courts to make claims about non-discrimination and other policy issues. And of course, HIV and the way it moved around the world pressed both groups and governments to begin to deal with sexuality in different ways. At the moment, increasingly, international organizations of all kinds were being asked to enter into the arena of sexuality. But it seemed to me what might be a positive development was also fraught with peril, for many reasons. Groups that work on human rights, health, women's issues, had very underdeveloped tools to think about sexuality, so they often fell back on folk knowledge, their naturalized and unexamined ideas of what sexuality was and how it worked. The state-level organizations and agreements involved in human rights conventions and instruments had long histories of regulating sexuality, largely on principles of morality, promoting reproduction, and public order. The involvement of these state-level organizations raised many questions about the repressive potential for how these developments would pan out, as well as the way the idea of rights potentially could be appropriated and used in many different ways. These were many of the topics that the terrific people involved in this Rockefeller program conversed about for 8 years. We hope to use the new deconstructive tools and work on sexuality to think more deeply about all of the assumptions we used in doing this work. We also thought a lot about what came to be called the nooks and crannies, all the different groups, identity-based groups, working in different locations, national locations, institutional locations, in many different ways on many different topics. The diversity was terrific. But slightly troubling was the fact that frequently each nook had no awareness of the other nooks and crannies. Groups sometimes developed theoretical tools without thought to how did that play out with the other groups. I don't mean to suggest that there needs to be a unified program or that all groups need to negotiate about what's appropriate ways to deal with sexual rights, but the cross-cutting connections between different groups, some who have identity-based names and many who don't, I think is an important way to think about how sexual rights could be going forward. We also realize that all projects of sexual rights have a big stake in understanding new forms of heterosexuality or heterosexualities. And queer theory may be right on target in its stinging critique of heteronormativity. But I think it can't share hostility to recognizing and seeing like-minded moments in the development and evolution of new forms of heterosexualities that are not based around reproduction in any way. We frequently came back to this troubling question of sexual representation, here in a different way, because of the tradition in human rights of documenting violations. That is, to show that they occurred, that the claims of human rights groups were trustworthy and not exaggerations. All projects of documentation in human rights raise a lot of questions, but add sex to it, and we're entering an even more difficult terrain. In sexuality, what can be shown? What's too graphic? What's too sexual? What violates various kinds of taboos? Who makes a good victim to illustrate a sexual abuse? Does that person have to be blameless or innocent? And how does that narrowed depiction affect the way sexual rights can be understood? Finally, in the way that human rights claims are put forward in regard to sexuality, in what ways might they unwittingly embrace pre-existing systems of sexual hierarchy? In the choice of innocent victims, in the choice of people from highly ranked class, gender, race groups, to show the horror of different kinds of sexual violation. We considered many questions that still are open issues. How can projects to link sexuality and rights be nested in broader claims for social justice, including the indivisibility of civil, political, social, and economic rights? What do sexual right advocates expect from the state across a range of repressive and protective possibilities? On the one hand, the human rights system relies on the state to forego rights-violating actions. On the other hand, the state has a long history of regulating sexuality. How do we make choices about what we ask the state to do? Or, less globally, how we ask specific states what we ask them to do? And what brakes we put in to perhaps stop the co-optation of seemingly worthwhile rights projects to further other national agendas. These conversations went on in many, many dimensions, in many, many ways. The most recent and interesting place they've fallen on is this question of trafficking, which I'd like to say a little about. It would seemingly have little to do with gay and lesbian issues, but I'd like to argue that it has a huge relationship. First, trafficking, for those of you who might not be familiar with what it is, according to U.S. law and also UN regulation, is the forced, coerced movement of people into any different kinds of work. That would seem unobjectionable. Surely we would all agree that forced or coerced movement into exploitative conditions of work is reprehensible and should be stopped. Yet, in the way the trafficking issue has been embraced, especially by this administration, and especially by what amounts to anti-porn feminists who have gone into anti-trafficking work, trafficking clusters around women, and it clusters around sexual exploitation, and trafficking comes to mean sex trafficking. So interestingly, the campaign against sex trafficking, and by extension, prostitution, has now come to be the Bush administration's chief sexual issue, and one of the main women's issues of the Christian right. We return in many ways to figures of the late 19th century, where a young and innocent victim needs to be rescued from terrible exploitation. The remedy for these harms is to control male lust and to keep young women at home. Migration is dangerous. The outside world is a liability. Sex is dangerous. The family offers protection. From a rights-based point of view, the remedies offered for these very real harms are never rights-based remedies. The affected people have no opportunity to participate in describing or discussing what these remedies should be. There's no imagined range of people with all sorts of different experiences who can't benefit from a one-size-fits-all intervention. The motives of the rescuers are never given any consideration, and the interventions are never examined as to how they really worked. What impact did they have on the people allegedly helped by them? Thinking back again to this 19th century moment and the very powerful social purity movements that grew up around trafficking and prostitution, we would note, for example, the passage of the criminalization of adult male consensual same-sex sex in Britain, which remained on the books for a long time, and in contemporary terms, the powerful normalization of sex outside anything but a very protected domestic sphere. It would be perhaps a sarcastic comment on my part, but perhaps not entirely inaccurate, that through a complex series of travels and movements, the feminist anti-pornography movement, in its worst form, has now become institutionalized in the Bush administration. And indeed, many individual figures active in that movement now have important positions in the current government. That's just to illustrate the complex interconnections of these efforts to claim sexual rights, the ways in which they can go wrong, the ways in which the remedies can be thoughtlessly proposed without adequate consultation to the affected people, and also without thinking carefully about what sexuality is at hand. What are we dealing with? Let me leave you with a couple of questions that I think sum up some important questions we still need to deal with. How do we recognize abuse and discrimination and document it without making the person described abject, without effacing that person and their needs, specificities, and locations? How do we not reduce them to simply the violation they've experienced? How do we address all ranges of sexual violations and rights abuses without inadvertently reasserting for women that purity is the most valuable thing they have, as Ellie Miller has pointed out, and without forgetting the need of the violated to have all sorts of kinds of agencies acknowledged and expanded? Finally, how do we expand the range of people considered worthy of rights protection to all people? People with and without identities, people working in all sorts of, appearing in all sorts of spheres, all sorts of locations. How do we think of sexual rights nesting in expression, in political association, in the so-called private and the public, in a whole realm of health protections, and in a whole way of imagining sexual rights as quite crucial to the project of democracy and citizenship? I still have the question, how would that work?
I did. Oh, like pencils. That's right. It's nice. You put on a nice event. Oh. So we can do it on each. This is better. This is closer to the cheese. Closer to the food. And